So good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for tuning in, particularly if you're tuning in again to this online webinar all about social engineering, psychology, awareness and users. And I'm really grateful for those of you who've persisted here, because we did record it once and it didn't work out too well, so this is a rerun. So just to talk first of all about what this is going to be about, as I say, we're going to talk about social engineering, and I am a social engineer. I've done it for many, many years, but I'm not a technical social engineer at all. So basically, when I do social engineering work, I work with psychology and people and the way the brain works. So I'll hopefully give some insights into that today. It's also a little bit disruptive because I think we very often focus on the users and why they behave the way they behave, but what I was interested in talking about today was really more about us. That's the security people who are tasked with creating awareness, persuading users to do the right thing. And I think I completely include myself in this group, but there are some things going against us in terms of user behaviour, which often seems so obvious to those of us in security, but doesn't seem always to quite work. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. One of our biggest frustrations, that people still fall for psychology and social engineering scams, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what that was and really how it works. So today I'm principally going to be discussing three tribes. Of course, the social engineers, of which I count myself as an ethical social engineer. I'm on the defence side of the business. And social engineers, to be honest, are not really a tribe. Typically, a social engineer, malicious social engineer, would work alone or in a small team. If it's a larger sort of social engineering con or scam, the type that would be instigated by a criminal network, organised crime network, then, they would often be working off scripts anyway. So typically, a social engineer wouldn't be bound by the sort of rules and norms and the morals, in fact, that those of us who work on the defence side always have, because we're in a business or we're working for a client. So you're talking about social engineers really with no loyalty to any particular group, no rules, no morals and no laws. And this is very freeing because they can operate with a very focused goal in mind and aren't really worried about who they offend and things like that. There's also a lack of hierarchy, and this gives them an advantage. So it's very important that we remember when we talk about tribes about the fact that they have this attack perspective, whereas we, on the inside, trying to help our users, trying to help ourselves, have a defence perspective a lot of the time. And so empathy, not necessarily sympathy, we don't need to agree with them, but empathy, being able to see things from someone else's perspective, is quite important. And then if we look at our users, I think there's a lot of discussion in security about this, even the term users, because it can be something that's quite derogatory. And, we do tend to say things like they're the weakest link and those types of things. But what we really need to think about is that we, on the security side, often group the users together. And that's actually going to be something I'm talking about today, because that can be quite dangerous. Not so much that they are a group, but that they're not in our group. So the users have lots of pressures on their time. The people that we work with who are not in security have their own goals. They have limited time, energy, and finite resources, and are in fact diverse in many ways, but it's just a shorthand to say they're the users. So diversity, obviously gender, age, nationality, expertise, the department they work in. And I think we need to be really careful not to stereotype users in one big group. Social engineers don't do this except at the human level. And really what a social engineer is looking to do is to individually profile a user to make an attack more effective. This is done particularly through things like social media, which I've spoken about in other webinars and presentations over the years. But a social engineer asks themselves, what unique information can I find? Not only on the company, but on the individual and the groups that they are in. And then their first question to themselves is really, how can I use this to get through? How can I use the individuality of this person to get through to the organisation, to get to them? So there's that. And then, really, the group I'm most interested in today is us, which is, I presume that a lot of people who are listening to this are on the security side or on the awareness side, and really we're the educators within a business. In what we do as security educators, we are highly knowledgeable as to the threats, and to the technology that might be used to instigate those threats. We are, to a degree, risk neutral more than the users would be, because if we, as security people, were constantly afraid of everything that might hit us, we'd be paralysed, we wouldn't be able to do our job very well. And often what we're trying to do is get people's attention without frightening them too much, and we're dismayed at what they fall for. So I wanted to sort of put us into three kind of tribes, if you like. This is called tribal warfare, and explain a bit more about why that might not help us when we're trying to educate our users. So let's look at what tribes are like. All human beings have a tendency to form into tribes, or groups, really. And we in security are not excluded from that. And tribes within any kind of business, any kind of group, tend to have a formal social structure. We share common fate and goals. It's part of the way that we identify as a tribe, is that we have these goals, and the consequences of not achieving things are common. It also includes some face-to-face interactions, and that doesn't necessarily mean human to human, but it does mean communication, probably regularly, backwards and forwards, and a certain degree of interdependence on each other. And what happens is, when all that comes into play, we sort of start to self-define as group members, and almost inevitably that means that subgroups begin to form. So let's look a little bit about what happens when we form into subgroups. Now, the uncomfortable truth is that we exhibit sort of set behaviours when we're in this subgroup. These would include things like withholding information from people who are outside of the group, and it's this in-group, out-group thinking that I'm going to really dig into in a minute. But when we see ourselves as a subgroup as opposed to a larger group, our goals aren't common anymore and our priorities change. So we would have specific objectives and tasks that the wider group within the business, the bigger tribe, would not necessarily share. And then, so there's a lot of psychology that shows that when we divide into these type of groups, a sort of strange mentality kicks in. We tend to categorize people as in or out, and also that we start to identify our self-concept, if you will, our self-esteem even, comes from social identity. And that's in part how it's derived from the evaluation of the group relative to the other groups that we know. Therefore, in order to raise our self-esteem, if we identify as part of any group, we tend to ridicule, to denigrate other groups, because it raises the value of the group and therefore of ourselves. And that's obviously quite dangerous, and it's something that I do see within the information security space, in all these headlines and everything that we see about users being the weakest link, and how stupid people can be, and that's still quite current in the lexicon of security. We also tend to be subject within a group to confirmation bias, which is really that we see evidence in other people's behaviour that supports a previously held view. So let's imagine that we're classifying all the users as out of our group. We're elevating our own group because it's linked to self-esteem. And this is just a tendency. I'm not sort of having a go at us. I'm just saying this is what happens in groups, really. And then confirmation bias kicks in, which is a tendency to only see and only pay attention to evidence that supports our previous view. So when the one person does let someone into the organisation, when someone does click on the link, when someone does fall for a phishing call, then we see that as evidence that we were right to class that group in some kind of detrimental way. So once we identify as this subgroup, unfortunately, these are the things that the way that people tend to think when they identify as a subgroup. And inevitably, this leads to conflict. And what I thought I'd do is give us an example, which I find really interesting, of how splitting into groups tends to pan out. And it's a case that's actually really interesting. It was done in the 1950s by a couple of psychologists and their team. Their name was the Sharifs. And what they decided to do is they wanted to try and understand the causes and consequences of intergroup conflict. And the way that they did this was that they took a group of, two groups of 12-year-old boys to a Robbers Cave State Park, which is a summer camp in the United States. And they took them separately, and they gave them a week of accelerated bonding. So they let them give themselves names, and the boys One group of boys called themselves the Rattlers, the rattlesnakes, the Rattlers, and the other group called themselves the Eagles. And during that first week, they were initially unaware that there was even another group on the site. The researchers managed to keep them very much apart. And during that first week, they really established some norms, some structures, some rules, some hierarchies, and became very closely bonded. So they identified well as a group. During the second week, what the researchers did was they introduced the groups to each other. So they let them know that there were two groups, and they started to introduce conflict. So they started to introduce a tournament with things like tug of war competitions, baseball competitions. And what happened was the groups started to attack each other. As soon as they realised there was another group there, they sort of reacted badly to situations. In fact, conflict went very quickly from just rejecting the other group, so saying that their friends or the types of friends that they would have would only be people within their own group. This is even though they were from the same socio-cultural background, the same age groups. There was nothing really obvious to distinguish them from the other group, but they had this huge group loyalty. So they start to reject the other groups. That turns very quickly into verbal insults, name-calling, warnings, and actually escalated really quickly into threatening behaviour and even violence. So one group burns the flag of the other group, their cabins were ransacked, their property was stolen. They became so aggressive in this competitive stage that they had to be kept separate by the researchers. So it was really quite an interesting thing. And what the researchers tried to do was to see whether there was a way they could resolve this conflict, because it was so deeply established so early on that these boys were in these tribes. And so what they tried to do, first of all, was give them good opportunities to communicate and to sort of live together. In the same way that they'd done it in that first week with the groups, the single groups, now they put the two groups together. So they had them eat together and that type of thing. And it didn't resolve the conflict. In fact, when they ate together, the boys had a food fight, a huge food fight. And it looked as if this conflict, this violence, this kind of competitive attitude that really didn't spring from anywhere much, wasn't going to be resolved. But it was resolved, and it was resolved when the two groups were given common, meaningful goals and a potential common enemy. So what the researchers did was they decided to engineer emergency situations around things like the water supply. So there was a water butt, and what they did was they got the boys, they said that it had been broken and possibly vandalised, and that the boys basically had to work together to fix it, that 12 people in the group was not enough to fix this, but when the larger group got together, they could fix it. And what they found was that then the groups started to cooperate. Then they started to identify as the wider group and started to resolve these conflicts. So initial goals didn't work. Initial common objectives were not deep enough, were not desperate enough to get the boys to unite as a wider group. But when it was an emergency, when it was vital to their sort of survival, when there was a common enemy, then the boys got together. So I found this interesting because I think if we look at security as a tribe, then the potentials for us sort of doing a very similar thing become very clear. We do have a strong purpose. We do have a strong purpose and sense of belonging to the group, and we do have a very strong tribal identity within security. This comes from the culture that's there, all the way that users are presented to us, the conference culture, the shared lexicon that we have. And I think there is a tendency, because we're constantly being marketed to think this way. Specifically, it sells to tell you that we are different, other, better perhaps, than the rest of the people in the company who are weak. And so I think that we're kind of subject, we're marketed to all the time to think that way. And I think it's quite difficult, given these tribal tendencies, to break out of it. Now, just for a minute, if I go back to the social engineers, for a second. Oops, there we go. The social engineers, it's a perfect storm for social engineers, because if we're constantly being marketed to as employees are the weakest link, and And I'm just flashing up on the screen some of these articles from the last couple of years or so, but I've seen loads of them just recently on Twitter, for example. The people are too weak, and that's exactly how a social engineer is going to see your people. So it creates this sort of perfect condition for social engineers to exploit these human weaknesses that exist and can't really be changed. So when we can't engage users very well, the industry almost has a vested interest in keeping the two of us apart. And if our SE hack comes on, we'll exploit that completely. I've spoken about this before in a separate presentation, but what I'm going to say is, what social engineers really are looking for are the psychological levers to get into an organisation, to get through to users. And I'm going to talk to you right now a little bit about the levers and then explain what the fulcrum is, because levers on their own are really just sticks. They exist, but they've no strength. But if we can place them on a decent fulcrum, as Archimedes said, we're going to move the world. So let's look at some of those psychological levers. A malicious social engineer is absolutely going to tap into the emotions of your users. That is, if we can create an emotional state in someone's brain, whether it's anger or fear, frustration, even if it's happiness, or even if it's, maybe there's something coming your way, maybe there's an advantage, maybe there's an award, maybe there's a free gift or something like that. Or whether we can say, you're not really doing your job very well, or I need you to do something for me, and if you don't, then something will happen. Then what happens is people become emotional. And emotions are not things that we can easily control. They exist, they're real, and what they do is they reduce our decision-making capacity very quickly. So our logical brain is sort of kicked off the cliff by our emotional brain, and social engineers know that, and they're trying to tap into it. But it goes deeper than that. What happens is it also taps into they try and tap into people's values. They try and tap into the things that they really care about, so that those things will motivate the people that they're talking to. And this is why sort of threatening people works so well. It's why ransomware works so well. It's not just that we lose our business files, perhaps, but it's that we might lose the photographs of our family or financial information. So the values are the things that people really are motivated by, the things that they really care about, are frightened of, or love, essentially. And a social engineer is going to tap into that whenever they can, because we know that there is almost nothing more powerful. And it's those values that give people the motivation to act. And in our case, as security people, that motivation to act in the wrong way, in a way that's not in their interests, through compromising our companies, our data, our systems. That's really what social engineers are looking to do on the malicious side. And it's also about self-belief. The belief that I wouldn't be fooled by this, the belief that I am a good person, a clever person, I am someone who behaves in a secure way. And as long as we can work out what those are through research and individual profiling, then we can always get to the individual. So those levers are always going to be there. But what happens is the fulcrum that gives those levers real power actually is the behaviour of the organisation. And we've spoken about it before. I'm sure we've heard lots of talks about, culture and the way organisations behave. But I want to talk about our security teams again, and I'm counting myself in this group. Our attitude to users, the fact that we might call them that and really see that as a bad sort of a denigrated term, is really leads to our behaviour. It leads to not perhaps what the organisation declares on a public level, but our behaviour when users don't understand straight away the danger that they're in, or don't actually forgive people when they've been the victim of a breach, or punish them very harshly. And those sorts of things are typically what would happen to create our behaviour. So people are not stupid. They understand excuse me just one second. They understand exactly what we think of them, and that manifests through our behaviour. So not what we say, but it's the deeds rather than the words. And when our behaviour over time is always the same, when people are always punished and penalised for doing things wrong or not understanding completely, it taps into the culture of the organisation. It becomes a culture of us and them. It becomes a culture of blame. And that's the fulcrum that a malicious social engineer will use, because whilst the levers are always there, we need something to leverage it on, and that's really what happens. So moving forward, what we need to think about next, again, is that tribal mentality, and thinking really about how this taps into what we are trying to achieve, because really being part of a tribe isn't useful. So what we need to do, I think, bearing in mind the tribal mentality and all these sort of psychological levers, is do what Buckminster Fuller told us to do. And he said, if those forces are there, don't fight them, try and use them. So what I wanted to talk about now is how we use all of this to make our users more aware and to do a better job at getting people to be more secure. So there's the levers again. How do we use them to get our users to do what we need them to do for their own safety and security? And actually, this is social engineering from the outside in. From the inside out rather than the outside in, because it's all of those things that I've just discussed happen to be very useful when we're trying to convince people of something. So what we are looking at now is tapping into the resolution, if we like, of all of this tribalism, all of these attack vectors, and seeing whether or not we can resolve the situation using similar methods. What we're really trying to do here is mobilize the troops and stop being lone warriors, stop being a tribe within a tribe, and kind of open things up to the wider goals of the company and the wider group. So the first thing that we can learn from the Robbers Cave experiment is that we need to find these common goals. But I'm putting it to you now that the common goals need to be very meaningful and not superficial. And so we have to stress the cooperation needed to achieve these goals. Now the thing about this is, what's a really strong common goal? Well, if we tap back into the values of people, tap back into what they really care about, and often that's our families, our money, our privacy, perhaps our identity. If we can link the secure behaviour we're trying to instill in people into those values that they hold so strongly, in the same way a malicious social engineer might do it, then we stand a very good chance of convincing them that this is a meaningful goal. And the only way that that can actually promote itself into motivation, into action to behave more securely, is if we stress how much we need their cooperation. And to do that, we have to stop thinking of them as a sort of inferior group and think of ourselves as part of this wider group. And some practical ways to do it include reducing this inequality in status. So we have to really change our attitude and our own beliefs as the security community, not just to say it, but to really believe that they are actually equal. And I think that this is quite a useful tool, because what we have in security is an army behind us, whereas the attackers don't necessarily have that army behind us. We can mobilise the troops, and we can see all the specialisms that exist in organisations and tell people that those specialisms are useful to this common goal. So our communication staff might help us get the message over better. Our marketing people might help us distribute it better. Technical people can try and demystify some of the things that confuse people and switches them off. So we go beyond sort of superficial interaction and really start to value people as individuals and get them on board with the mission. It's in our interest to do this, and it's in our interest, in fact, to lead, but hand back the lead to the people within the company. So that means that once we have educated us to the threats that are out there, we pass it back and start to collapse the groups. We reintegrate people into the broader group as part of this mission for the organisation to be more secure. So we need to stress how individual characteristics and personalities and skills can assist the security mission. And this obviously isn't something that happens quickly. It's not something that happens easily, but over time, it's what really will count in making you more secure. And it does free up our technical security people to get on with everything else they need to get on with in order to secure our systems and our technology. So the resolution actually isn't so difficult. It's just that we have to pass it back to the people and make sure they know about it. And this is a much more integrated mission than I think just we're going to tell you what this is and perhaps why you should be secure and then kind of leave you to it. So it's a really interactive, remember those face-to-face interactions I spoke about at the beginning? It's a really inclusive way of looking at the solution to insecure behaviour. And so I spoke about the levers in terms of the attack perspective, but I want to just mention how we use them, at least one of them anyway, in this defence stance that I'm talking about, and particularly the way we use emotion, because I see so much talk about fear in the space. So many articles about why we shouldn't use fear, why we can't frighten people into compliance, why we sort of shouldn't sell on fear. But one of the problems is we do actually have to tell people how frightening something is. The reason for this is that people are not stupid, and that if we can show, because insecurity we know the potential consequences of clicking on the link or of speaking to the wrong person and trusting people falsely, then that is actually in and of itself something that is quite frightening. There are huge consequences to insecure behaviour. When we try and shield people from fear, when we tell people that fear is not what we're trying to do, it's a false promise, right? If we inform people properly, whether it's from social engineering or a more technical perspective, of the consequences of this behaviour, then they have every right as grown-ups to feel some fear. What we have to do is then give them the tools to deal with that fear as well. So this is an attacker, this is what's potentially out there, this is how someone gets to you, and in this situation we have your back, and this is what we need you to do. So someone to report this to, knowing where to send the email to when they're suspicious of it, knowing that the company will back you if a professional con artist, which is what a social engineer is, attempts to con you. So when those things are sort of in a row, we then motivate people to do the right thing. And they do it in their own self-interest, not the interest of the company. They do it in their own self-interest. Because what is frightening, but is a fact, is that malicious social engineers will absolutely use an individual as a conduit to the organisation. Their data, the people they love, their identity and their money can all be used to get to the company. That is scary. And I think what we do is we patronise people sometimes, or we're encouraged to patronise people by saying, this is what can happen to you, but don't be too frightened of it. No, let them be frightened, but then get their back and show them what they can do in the emotional state of fear. Because remember, in that emotional state of fear, or any emotional state, we don't make good decisions. So really, part of our job is to take the decision away. So if you feel this emotion, if you feel worry or fear about something that's coming at you, this is exactly what you do in that situation. And then they don't have to try and make a decision. They just know, this feels wrong, the company has got my back, they don't want me to be caught out, so I have to do this. So it's about action again, more than words, I think. So just a little bit more on fear here, because I really do, it really just gets me the amount of talk about not selling on fear. I'm not saying that we sell entirely on fear, but what I am saying is the fear exists and therefore we have to deal with it. And remember, the fear is a survival tool. Our fear of things like snakes, heights, loud bangs is innate in every human being, and it's there to protect us. Our deep, our older parts of our brain react very viscerally to fear, because to those stimulus, because it's a survival tool, because it's better for us to see a hosepipe on the ground, react as if it's a snake and be wrong, than see a snake on the ground and be bitten because we thought it was a hosepipe. So your brain is simply going to make you react in a certain way. So it is a survival tool, and it's how people learn what's dangerous. It's a necessary thing, it's a powerful thing, but what we can do is master it by breaking it down. And I think that's part of our awareness program too, that we break it down to exactly how it works, exactly how some of these cons work and what the consequences are, and then stage by stage plan actions so that people know what they're going to do. So we're going to bring all of this into the open, make it a discussion point, led by the users, led by the people who are not in security as equals, and what you'll find is the organisation by default begins to be more secure. Our culture will change. So Buckminster Fuller again. I love Buckminster Fuller because I think a lot of the things he says made so much sense. And, what he said here was that you're never going to change things by fighting the existing reality. You have to create a new model that makes the old one obsolete. And what I'm saying to you now, and just to finish quickly, is that the old model of, us, the security team, us, the awareness team, talking to the users, sort of dumbing the message down a bit, maybe sugarcoating it a little bit, trying not to give them the full story, is in fact obsolete. What we need to do is be honest with people and show them exactly what the threats are. One of the things in communication theory that I talk about a lot is if we don't give people our version of the story, they will make up their own. And what human beings are really great at doing is using their imagination to imagine the worst possible consequences and to sort of catastrophize the consequences of their actions. So what we do is we make their story something that we give them and let them run with it, but in a measured way, because we know how to help and we know that they can help themselves. So that's what makes the existing model obsolete, and I think we are perfectly placed to change it because a lot of what goes on comes from the tribe of security. So just to finish, and I've got a few minutes afterwards if there are any questions, please ping them through. But just to finish off, I think our action is to unite the clans here. I think that we are in tribes within organisations, and security perhaps is one of the very strongest. And I think this is a situation that requires leadership. And it's so funny to me because when I present on this type of topic, people say, this almost sounds like HR. It's a cultural thing. Well, it is those things, but it's also a leadership thing. If security personnel are the experts in this area, then we have to lead the clans. We have to lead all of our troops and make sure that they're united. And if we do that, we have to understand the way people work and how to use it to our advantage, but also to their advantage. If we do that, then when social engineers tap into those levers, the fulcrum in which they try and give it leverage, the attitude, behaviour and culture of the company actually doesn't give it leverage, it gives us leverage as the group that's trying to protect everyone else. So I think if we do all those things and if we bear all this in mind, then attacks from social engineers and from other potential hackers and attackers suddenly becomes very an awful lot less powerful. So I hope you enjoyed that today. I was trying to give you some value that you could take away and some actions that you could take away and immediately start thinking about these things, perhaps in a little bit of a different way. And I really appreciate you listening to it. I have been asked for a few questions from the audience, but I appreciate that we're sort of coming to the end of it now and that this is the second run of this webinar. So I appreciate that. If you'd like, I've put my Twitter handle and my website up here. And there are lots of interviews with people from the security industry on the Human Factor podcast, and the links to that are on my website. But I hope you found this of value, and I appreciate everybody listening. Thank you for tuning in again, and the recording will be available very, very soon. Take care, and remember, we're all only human. Bye for now.